Welcome to our July webinar on developing leaders in turbulent times. One of the things we know is that leadership can make or break an organization's future, especially during turbulent times. Few strategic challenges are more compelling than identifying, developing, and properly positioning the leaders of tomorrow. Successful organizations embed leadership responsibility at all levels and invest heavily in leadership development. With the psychological and emotional role that leaders need to play if they are to optimize both morale and productivity. And I'll say during turbulent times, which is the subject here, but I think all times are turbulent, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. But it's really more important than ever that organizations understand the types of leadership behaviors that are really critical during times of change. I am Linda Nelson, and I am your speaker today. I'm the president of ICOR, and I work as volunteer as a member of the U.S. delegation for Technical Committee 292 and work on different standards, including crisis management, business continuity, and organizational resilience, as well as community resilience, or what they're calling urban resilience. So the question becomes, what do we mean by uncertainty? And so we're going to talk about that first and look at how leaders should respond to uncertainty. Then we will move to looking at different leadership styles and what kinds of leadership skills are really needed to build a more resilient organization. And we're going to focus specifically on the adaptive and inclusive leader and what kinds of attributes do those types of leaders have. And then we will finish by looking at the kind of the new era. And I think we're calling the new era anything, post-COVID or that, kind of 2022 and forward, even though COVID is still real and still happening. But the idea that we're in a new era, life has changed, and we need to create some new mindsets for managing during this era of continuous change and uncertainty. The recording of the webinar on the ICOR webinar page will probably not be available until next week, but it will be available. Will be available to you on the YouTube channel probably by Friday. If you have questions, use the questions button. We will have time today to take some questions, and we will be doing some polling as well. In order to receive a certificate of attendance, you need to attend a minimum of 35 minutes. So let's get into our first poll. And I just so have an idea of who's attending here today and to give you some context for some of the discussions that we're going to have. So at what level of the organization are you a leader? And this assumption is that all of you are leaders in some way. So choose all that apply. And we're going to give you about 30 seconds for that. All right, I'll give you about 3 more seconds. Well, interestingly, we have about 32% in top or senior management, 54% in middle management, 21% more operational types of management, and 25% of you operate as team leaders. So I want you to think as we're going through today's webinar, I want you to think about the type of leader that you are and how you manage the area that you do lead in, and also to really think about how are you as a leader living through unprecedented challenges. Most of us, no matter where you are in the world today, are being impacted by the climate crisis and in the heat waves that are impacting everyone globally, especially during this month of July. We've also seen, of course, the impact of globalization and geopolitics, which is impacting everything from inflation, any number of ways. One of the things that's been really prominent in the post-COVID world is the changing of social values. And I don't think it's actually the changing of social values. It's the it's where this is coming to the forefront. And it's becoming something that people are putting really sometimes before money and sometimes a lot of times before, like for example, a salary that you're making, but just looking at the importance of social values. And we will be talking more about that today as well. And of course, as the world has gotten smaller and smaller, having those global health challenges. Of course, we need to start with an acronym because everybody has acronyms. And, I'm sure you've heard of this acronym, and I pronounce it VUCA, but I've heard people pronounce it in different ways. But essentially, for a generation of business leaders, we've really been operating and living through what we believed were uncertain times, with continuous upheavals and disruptions and global shifts in things like technology and others. And so, when we talk about the fact that today's world is volatile and it's an environment that demands you to react quickly to ongoing changes that are unpredictable and outside of your control. It's also an environment that is uncertain, where it requires you to take action during these uncertain times and requires you to take action without certainty. It's also complex. We're seeing more than one thing happening. So the environment is dynamic, there's many interdependencies, and it's also ambiguous, where the environment is sometimes unfamiliar and outside of our expertise. One of the things that we're talking about is that we can also look at uncertainty as being defined in terms of novelty. And you heard, the coronavirus was the novel coronavirus. Well, the fact is that novelty is getting a new name, meaning that we're seeing novel things happening all the time. We're also seeing magnitude happening. So things are happening um, at more severe levels. So if you look at just things like a heat wave, no matter where you live, if you're in the northern hemisphere, I should say no matter where you live. Well, in the northern hemisphere, July tends to be the time of heat waves. Well, now we're seeing heat waves that instead of just being, a week or something, we're having them on a very regular basis. And our uncertainty is also happening taking a longer time. So when we have a crisis, that crisis seems to be lasting longer than normal. And so and there's more and more of that change that's happening. And so because of these things, where our crises are novel, they're at a higher magnitude, they're at a longer duration, and we're seeing rapid pace of change, it's going to require us to look at ourselves as leaders and how we might have to change our leadership style based on that, as well as new operating models. And we're seeing that more and more as people change where they work and how they work to get to the same place or to get to a better place than we were before. So we need to be considering how we continue to adapt and to make sure that our organization is sustainable and that we're able to take advantage of new opportunities. So typical responses to uncertainty, um, I always like some of these graphics, but there's tough decisions ahead, and we talked about that uncertainty, we're seeing it at a higher magnitude and a longer duration, but we also have shorter time frames in order to make those decisions. And because of this, that contextual uncertainty makes decision making harder as well. And so as decision makers, your time frame is shortened and your context is much less certain. And so it makes your decision making commensurately harder. However, leadership tends to kind of fall into three typical responses. One is called decision paralysis. And this is when, you just don't make any decisions because you're just kind of stuck. We also see people that wish away complexity and just say, let's just either we're not going to deal with it or it's not as complex as it seems. Let's just keep it simple. And sometimes I think even the worst is when you have overconfidence and you think it's no big deal and that you can handle it. So we're kind of doing next here a then versus now. Kind of the leadership style was to preserve stability to keep things within scale and be very predictable. And the fact is that for a lot of years, life has been more or less predictable. And when that focus is on maximizing your earnings, and because you're seeing things as predictable and stable, this is a very effective model. However, now that we're in a much less stable and predictable environment, we need to move to operating with in a more collaborative way, using collaborative networks of self-managing teams that operate in rapid cycles, or maybe you want to call them agile cycles, and focus on creating value during that time of constant change and uncertainty. So the question becomes, what does leadership look like during this time of uncertainty? And and how should leaders navigate? And how do you just manage during times of turbulence and when this is really becoming the norm of what we are? So there are some typical, like we said, leadership responses to uncertainty, but let's think about how you should be leading through uncertainty. The first thing that's recommended is that you be direct. The more complex the situation, the more direct you should be. Be fully transparent and share information with your team and the people that work with you. Because when you are transparent in your information and how you communicate, you're going to gain mutual trust and people are going to be more collaborative with you. Also be very understandable, especially in ambiguous situations. Make sure you're very clear. So you're being direct and you're also being very clear about your purpose, the direction, your responsibilities, and doing this is going to empower others to come along with you. You also need to be very reliable. People need to depend on you. As a leader, if you expect people to follow you and do what you say and collaborate with you in order to make decisions that'll help you as well, you need to be reliable and follow through on what you've said and what you've agreed to. And this is going to help to accelerate more of a positive momentum. And finally, be trustworthy. You need to invest in your people, you need to keep your teams engaged, make sure you involve your partners, and seek to understand what others are telling you, speak to be understood, and act with respect. And this is really an always act with respect. So there are many different leadership styles. They different leaders or different styles of leadership have different names. This is the one that I felt was I guess the easiest to understand and and I've seen used most often. But you'll see in different leadership style designations that they all look about the same. They might use a little bit different terms. So an affiliative leader is someone who creates emotional bonds and harmony and really who tries to work and to heal rifts in your teams and also really motivates people during stressful time. This is a very positive climate, as you can see with the smiley face. And kind of the mindset is that people come first. The second positive leader is a democratic leader. And this kind of leader builds consensus through participation. This leader works best to create consensus or to get when you're trying to get input and ask the questions, what do you think? Now, the commanding mindset says that it creates a negative climate, but I will advocate that sometimes you need to be commanding when you don't have time for consensus and you don't have time to, get people to come on board. You just need them to do what needs to be done, and it needs to be done right now. And so, this commanding leadership style, I would suggest that you use it when you need to and use it sparingly so that when you use it, you're listened to because it is different than how you normally lead people. And sometimes, even as a parent, when my kids were younger, I would be just do as I tell you to do. Would you just do what I tell you? And obviously, you can't speak that way to people, but you need to really make sure that you are commanding when you're in a crisis situation that requires people to listen to you right now. Also, pace setting says that this is a negative climate as well, but this means that expecting excellence and self-direction, which I think you should expect. And it does work best when you're trying to get quick results from a highly competent team. And it is kind of that mindset of, do as I do and do it now. And maybe it's that now piece that becomes more negative, but I think you can also use that pace setting leadership style when you need to, especially when you've got a really good team that you already have that trust and it's in place and people respect you and they're willing to follow you. The visionary is, of course, the one that gets the double smiley faces. It is the most positive climate. It really says, come along with me, and here is where you're mobilizing people toward a vision. But it's something that really works best when you have a clear direction or you're trying to get through change. And so, as we're talking about managing change, this leadership style really jumps ahead of some of the other leadership styles. And finally, the fourth positive climate one is the coaching one, where you're teaching, you're mentoring, where you're trying to develop your people for the future. It really works best when helping people and building that long-term strength, and you're encouraging them to try this. But I want to remind you is that um, there are these different leadership styles for a reason, and a leadership style is a tool. It's a tool in your toolkit or in your tool belt. It's not a personality trait. And each one of us has a natural way that we lead. But the fact is that we need to master four or more, and especially those four positive ones. I think it's pretty easy to master the commanding one. It's a default for many of us, but just making sure that you're trying to get the best climate and vision style. And this idea that you need to be able to switch from one leadership style to another as needed. Now, to do that, you also need to have some emotional intelligence. You're not going to be able to quote read the room if you're not able to understand how people are reacting to you and where it is you need them to go. And so having the emotional intelligence to do that is really important. And in a recent study, they found that executives who lacked emotional intelligence were rarely rated as outstanding, and their divisions or whoever they have working for them underperformed by an average of almost 20%. And so this is really important for you to understand is that role of emotional intelligence and how it helps you. So what I'd like you to do, we've identified 6 leadership styles, and because of the polls, how they're set up in GoToWebinar, we can only have 5 choices. So I just left commanding out, but I would um, like you to consider in which of the leadership styles you think you'd like to be stronger in. So where do you want to grow as far as your leadership style? And again, you might choose more than one of these. I was talking about this with a friend of mine who is younger, and I've been doing some mentoring with her. And what she shared is that she doesn't want to lead during uncertain times. She doesn't mind being a team leader, but she just doesn't like being in a crisis mode. She's very good at it, but it's not something that makes her happy. And so, she's really much more working on her affiliative approach and her coaching approach to leadership and really stepping aside when there's some sort of a crisis piece, unless she is the person that needs to be in charge. So I'll give you about 2 more seconds. So not surprisingly, um, most of us, many of you, including myself, are trying to be more visionary. I think obviously it's the leadership style that has been found to be the most effective. Um, but also that coaching is right, I don't want to say right behind it, it's 40 points behind it. But coaching is being seen more and more, that whole mentoring, using that, you need to have that team approach also. Um, and the coaching model really works in a team, as does that affiliative approach. The the consensus driven, I think, is very effective, what I would say under normal working conditions, but sometimes you don't have time to be democratic and get that consensus driven. You do have a time to meet when we talk about during times of uncertainty that you need to make decisions quickly. And so that democratic approach doesn't necessarily work as well as some of the others. So this next set of leadership skill descriptions and kind of behaviors that you might want to follow isn't really anything new. This has been around for, I want to say, about 15 to 20 years, but I still believe that it is relevant for today. So as a leader, being able to see things for what they are, being able to just be real and recognize events and their significance, and don't shy away from the consequences of what you see. This is kind of this idea of having intellectual integrity. You think what is best for the organization versus what is best for your own personal gain. And so just being able to see clearly is really important. The other aspect is being, or I might even use the word attribute. I think attribute is good, as well as how you manage. What kinds of leadership attributes should you see? This idea of being able to see the big picture, but also being able to see the moving parts. And I often show this picture of the elephant with the blind people, trying to identify what it is they see. But one of the things that you see in leaders is that they can see the big picture, but they can't always see the moving parts. And then you have the micromanagers who are just looking at all the small parts and maybe miss the big picture. So it's really important to have that dual where you can dig deep in the detail without getting mired in it, and being able to have detailed knowledge about the issues and then use that to view the problem realistically and develop a strategy about how to manage that. The other leadership attribute that's really important is to be able to consider multiple approaches. And you see it, you have some kind of problem ahead of you, and maybe you brainstorm with others to get some potential solutions, and you're not using judgment, you're just asking people for their wild ideas on what might happen. Even though you might think about, this is how I think it should be, you're willing and you're confident enough to go out and get different opinions, because knowing that maybe your way isn't the best way and you just hadn't seen it. And so just having that opportunity to listen to others is important. But also understanding that along with that, it is your job to make a decision. And to do that, you need to be decisive. And so once you've listened to others, being able to take that information along with any data that you have. And then the fact is that as a leader, you probably have some experience in dealing with having to make difficult decisions. And so just leaning on that experience to help you. All of this also means that you need to take ownership of the problem and collaborate. So it kind of goes back to listening to others and knowing that you have to have input from many other stakeholders. So it's really interesting to see that you're seeing that coming up in more than one of the attributes, but being able to identify, um, who you should be collaborating with, and get to a solution that is somewhere in the middle where people can get along and really feel like they can deal with the solution, even if it isn't one maybe that they totally believed in. As well as listening, you need to listen to unpopular advice. So we've talked about getting people and listening to people, but you also have to listen to people who you might not agree with. And this is really, really essential, because a lot of times leaders surround themselves with like-minded thinkers. And this becomes really an issue because you're really in one-dimensional thinking and you feel like you're all moving in the right direction. And there's so many great examples of this in the working market, and what you see as failures is, not having enough diversity of thought and not willing to seek out different perspectives on your issue. And so your closest advisors are probably going to want to agree with you for the most part. And so really being able to get that diverse group of people and being willing to listen to that unwanted or that different advice might be really helpful to you. You also need to be calm and courageous and positive. If you see a leader panicking, um, people are going to panic and they're not going to be willing to listen to you because of that panicking. So we understand that you're panicking on the inside, but you need to be able to remain even tempered, and you need to be able to deliver bad news, even when in a way that helps you to avoid panic And it also sets that realistic level of hope for the future. So this is what's happening. Remember, we said that you had to be real, you had to be truthful, you had to be direct, and you had to share information in a way that does that. But you also need to do it in a way that's hopeful. Okay, this is all the bad stuff that's happening, but these are some things that we're looking at for how we can manage that and move ahead. And so just being courageous enough to make decisions that you've identified as being correct by listening to others and following your gut if you have to and your experience, even if they're not popular. Now, those of you that whose jobs are around managing risk, this is where it's really, really interesting. When you poll people who are in risk management, they tend to be very risk averse. Well, if you're going to be a leader in your organization and if you're going to be leading and making your organization stronger within the resilience aspect, you have to be willing to take risk in the face of risk because you're going to be in a situation where there is bad news and you're going to have to make a decision that may not be popular, but you have to move forward and you can't just be in that decision dilemma where you can't move in either direction. So it goes back again to gathering data and viewpoints from people who you might not agree with, but it is going to help you to take risk in the face of risk. And we're not saying take wild risk. We're talking about taking a calculated risk. We also talked about the fact that you're not always going to have enough information to be able to make a decision like you would like to make it. So it's kind of that 80-20 rule. You certainly want to make the right decision, and you're understanding that you're not going to have all the information you need. I remember doing an exercise with a company, and they had a real public relations reputational crisis that we were using for the scenario, and we knew that their communications team was mostly made up of marketing people, and they weren't used to having to write communications during a crisis time. So we literally gave them the scenario ahead of time, as well as the index of when they were going to need to come up with a communication that they would be sharing. And they came back and totally failed at this activity because their answer was, we don't have enough information. And our answer back to them is, you have to make a decision based on the information we have right now. Even if you qualify it by saying, based on the information available to us at this time, this is what the organization is going to be doing to manage this crisis. You have to be able to do that. And so leaders understand that an imperfect decision is going to be better than making no decision at all. And you might need to fine tune it later, but you need to be comfortable making decisions when you don't have the information that you would like to have. And then finally, you need to be a leader who makes mistakes. Remember, we talked about being courageous. You have to take calculated risks, and you're going to make mistakes. And because a crisis requires you to make almost continuous decisions, and the volume of them means that you're not going to be correct all the time. And so you need to be willing to make mistakes and being willing to admit to those, not being prepared to make mistakes, but really being prepared to admit mistakes. So this next poll is a little bit different. We've identified kind of 18 behaviors for leaders and attributes of really good leaders during a crisis. What I want you to do is give yourself 1 point for each of these. And I'm going to have it up here for about a minute, and then you're going to, and in the poll, you're going to share how many points that you got. So I'm going to give you about, I'll say 30 seconds to a minute. So go ahead and start giving yourself points for these 18. 18 is the top score. And we're really doing this to help you think about who you are as a leader and how you can get better at what it is that you're at in your leadership styles. All right, I'm going to do a countdown of 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So the question is, how many points did you give yourself in this? I'm glad to see that nobody gave themselves less than 5. All right. So about 46% of you gave yourselves more than half of these leadership skills, which is really great. And so as you're looking at these, kind of consider which ones you need to work on. And one of the things that I find a challenge, and I'll say this as a woman, and I'm not trying to be gender biased or anything, but a lot of times women are more willing to admit mistakes than men. That's just me, Linda, throwing that out there. And sometimes, sorry, men, but sometimes men as well, I'll say as well as women, then sometimes are judgmental. So when you're thinking you're being a good leader by recognize a mistake that you've made and how you're going to correct it, sometimes people see that as a weakness. And I would hope that that would change because if we're going to be real with people, we need to be able to admit our mistakes, and we need to be able to have the confidence and the courage to do that. So our next section we're going to talk about being an adaptive and an inclusive leader. We finished the last group off with talking about the fact that you need to be emotionally intelligent as a leader. You need to be sensitive to the feelings of others and understand that change isn't easy, and just having some empathy, because this will help boost morale and help builds that trust as well. Because a workforce that feels heard and supported is really much more likely to put it in the hard work it takes to achieve the goals of the organization. You also need to be fair. You're not going to be trusted unless you're fair. And so some people call this organizational justice. I like to just say it's fair. So you need to be open and honest, even if the truth is hard to hear. And we talked about being direct and to share the information. So you need to give employees and stakeholders, as well as your shareholders, the facts. And this honesty is going to ensure that the changes and the decisions that you're making are both accepted and understood. On the other side, you need to be willing to try new things. You need to be willing to innovate and experiment. You need to try stuff to just see if you're going to be better prepared to manage during this time of uncertainty and change. And to do that, you have to allow people to innovate and experiment, which isn't always easy because that takes time as well. But you need to be able to encourage and empower your people to innovate and experiment to help them reach their full potential as well as to fully contribute to the organization. We talked about being willing to admit mistakes. So you're seeing a lot of crossover between what makes a good leader and an adaptive leader is, one of the ways that you can be a better leader. Don't keep doing things if they're not working. Being willing to stop and try something else. And remember, if you're going to do that, you also need to embrace diversity and getting different people to talk to you. You also need to consider um, how you're going to anticipate challenges. So not just react to challenges, but also anticipated challenges. And start looking at what are the root causes of the things that are happening. And is there some risks that we can avoid by identifying those root causes and being able to decide then as well, if you're anticipating challenges, maybe you can take an opportunity um, out of a potential risk that you see coming ahead so that you're ahead of it versus just reacting and responding to it. And again, you have to be a decision maker who's open to feedback and being able to shift direction when you need to. I wanted to give 2 examples of adaptive leaders. Um, the first one is, they're both from the United States, but the first one is Abraham Lincoln. He accepted diversity. He appointed rivals in his cabinet, and he was always open to both debate and criticism. Interestingly enough, as a president now, I will say he did get assassinated, but didn't happen in his office. But he did have an open door policy, and he invited the citizens of the United States to discuss their challenges with him. And this attentive ear and that natural empathy really helped him to earn the respect of even his rivals that were in the cabinet. Another person who is considered an adaptive leader is General George Patton. And there's some great quotes that you can get from him and some learnings that you can get from him. But one of the things he said that he solicited input from his team. And in fact, going into one battle, he actually demanded input from his team and the soldiers. And he said, I want to hear from each one of you what you believe the trouble is going to be and the challenges, what we're going to have. And I expect you to share that with me. And I expect you to share that with me right now because we have to make decisions right now. So it was literally asking even the lowest, um, the, the people that he was leading to give input to that. The other thing he was very good at having a backup plan. Now we talked about um, the fact that you have to be trusted. And to be trusted, you have to be inclusive. Everyone has to matter. You can't give preference to certain people over others. And so when you talk about having an inclusive work environment, what I'm trying to get you to do is think beyond diversity, equity, inclusion, which is very important, not undermining that at all, but I'm asking you to think about the one of those, which is being inclusive in your work environment. And so it gets down to your leaders. What leaders say and do makes up to 70% difference as to whether individuals in the company feel included. And so you need to address issues such as what makes people feel included in the organization and what helps them to feel like they're treated fairly and that they're valued. So let's take a little bit deeper look into this. McKinsey has put out a report on organizational performance and looking at how the people in your organization, in other words, your leaders, not just policies, make or break an inclusive workforce or inclusive workplace. It has to go well beyond policy. And so, to be inclusive, your leaders, and I want to say each one of you is a leader somewhere. In fact, they didn't even give you the option to say you're not a leader anywhere because you are. Even if it's just leading yourself, you do work with other people. And so being a role model, kind of translating information, and being able to really support your organizational values and priorities helps you to shape those positive perceptions. And so when we look at what are those positive perceptions, they are generally around mentoring, having inclusive leadership, and being fair or being just. And so to do that, we've talked about participative decision making. So what I hope that you're hearing is that reference after reference is giving us some of that same information, that you need to encourage and incorporate a broad set of ideas and input from all of your colleagues when you make those decisions. You also need to build teams. We're going to be working if you're not already, in cross-functional teams that are networking, and to do that, cannot work in teams unless you're fostering trust, collaboration, and what I'll call healthy conflict. And healthy conflict helps you to build bonds. And you know that your team is not effective if you don't have any conflict, because that means that people are not speaking up. And when we have more and more of our meetings virtually, it becomes much more difficult to identify people who are not speaking up because you're not seeing eye contact and you can't see body language and you're not able to address it front on. So as leaders, this is going to continue to be a challenge for us, is to how do we foster trust, collaboration, and healthy conflict when we're in a more of a virtual environment. And that trust is not going to happen unless you are inclusive and impartial. This means, from allocating resources to making decisions, you have to be impartial for everyone. We know that inclusion is impacted by your organizational systems and the behavior of the leaders and your peers as well as your team members. So I would ask you, do you feel included on the team that you're on? And then what are your peers and your team members doing? What are your leaders doing? And what kind of systems do we have in place to make sure that people feel included? So one of the things that we've talked about in more resilient organizations is that there's clarity of purpose. and that we're all moving in the same direction. So this becomes that kind of collective identity. And so being able to unite all your people around that overarching purpose, and to make sure that you're creating objectives and consistent processes for personnel decisions and how you reward people with your merit-based rewards. And finally, really looking at accessibility to resources. People should have equal access to information, opportunities, and those and relationships by being on teams in order to be successful. So, kind of to summarize again, being an inclusive leader means you're seeking out those missing perspectives. So, actually going a little bit farther even than what we said before, which is drawing people out, making sure everybody has that voice, and really encouraging people to speak up. And in speaking up by just the people that are silent, but also speaking up, this is goes kind of goes back to the bullying that you maybe have heard if you have had kids in school or even when you were in school, is that if you just let people say something that's uninformed or offensive, it's assumed that you agree with that person. And so you can't let it slide. It's really, really important that as a leader that you speak up and address comments that need to be addressed, and really encouraging others to do the same. So let's look at kind of 5 mindsets of what we should be focusing on as we move through this transition kind of from one era of working to another. So we need to focus on moving from being a manager to being a visionary. And most of you said that you wanted to try to be a better visionary. And so instead of trying to preserve what you have, move to the mindset of what could be and what is your possibility. So many of us, we get so uncomfortable with change, we just hold on to what we have. And so we need to start letting go and to think about what we could be and moving beyond that. Everything's moving to being from a profit level to generating impact to all of your stakeholders and moving to really that customer focused approach, and how your organization contributes to society and that healthy planet, which goes back to the social norms are changing, and what the expectations of what organizations do is also changing. And from having zero, environmental impact to actually doing something to help other people in other parts of the world, it's becoming something that is not going to go away and that are being expected of you. And so here is where you need to look at how the organization creates value. And I was kind of laughing when I was looking at this image. The guy on the left looks to be the same as the guy on the right, just from the other side and wearing a different hat and different shirt. When you talk about diversity, I don't think they did a great job with this picture. But this idea is, how does your organization create value? And how do you create value as a leader in your organization? And so move from thinking about your competition. We know you have to be competitive, but move from just thinking about your competition to thinking about how can we create something new together. So creating new levels of value for your customers. And you can do this by looking at, we have a platform of core competencies in our portfolio and how we can continuously evolve our portfolio so that it's meeting the needs of our clients. And that's where we go back to kind of that agile project management piece. If you're working as an agile organization and you're close to your customers, you're understanding how their needs are changing. And also look at how can we develop creative partnerships with that mindset of reimagining how we can do what we've been doing. We also need to think about how we organize and moving from kind of that command workplace to that collaborative workplace. And this is also means that when you're in, where you work and how you work becomes important. And it becomes a catalyst for how you do that. So be a catalyst in your leadership role that empowers and guides those self-managing teams. We need to get to self-managing teams. It's not going to go away. You need to foster connections, and that's why we need that affiliative leader, somebody who can get people to get along and help to manage some of those conflicts, and to open up that dialogue and cooperation. If you're going to be a Democrat democratic leader and you want to have consensus, that means people have to feel comfortable enough to speak and to be that this is a partnership that we're all working together to move in that same direction. So, how you can cultivate trust and respect and compassion that you do that. And we talked about being direct and open. And this is where this really helps you. Having that stance of openness and that mindset of collaboration will help you to do that. When we look at how we get work done, so I've mentioned we've inferred that all the way through this webinar about moving from being individual leaders to being networked leadership teams that steer the organization. So, I'll just give a personal example of I have always had a mindset of being a single leader. I grew up um, and wanted to always be a teacher. And as you know, teachers work in classrooms and they're in charge of their classrooms. Even teaching has finally changed. The education, the university, the public school environment takes forever to change. I think it's other than government, educational bodies in the public sector and in universities tend to take the longest to make any sort of change. And so even teachers are now being required to work in teams and to move forward that way. And so my thing is if someone like me can do it, anyone can do it. And so really fighting that inner battle of just let me do it on my own and I'll get it done faster. Sometimes getting it done faster is not getting it done better. And we can't have all the answers. As our world becomes more complex and the problems that we're trying to solve becomes more difficult, we need to really rely on the expertise of our team. And I want to apologize. I just noticed that all the little pictures on here are men. So please disregard that and understand that I don't know. I didn't even notice that before. But we need to be a learning organization. You can't be a learning organization if you're not talking to people and you're not sharing information. So we need to really go beyond being controllers and being in charge to being coaches. And that goes back to that coaching leadership style as well, where you're trying to foster that exploration and that rapid learning with the mindset of discovery. So we all need to start looking at it's not just the R&D team that need to be innovative and experimenting. It needs to be all of us because we all see the organization and what it is that we're doing in our jobs from different perspectives. Sorry, I double clicked. And I want to go back to how we show up. And we need to really move from being someone who meets expectations and you're conforming to fit in to being really authentic and human. And I'm really hoping that being more authentic and human will stop being seen as a weakness and start being seen as a strength. People are not going to be honest with you and are not going to share with you and be willing to speak with you if you are not human. And so this idea of being a more human world is one that I think is really, really important. And so instead of, I used to see myself as the teacher. Well, instead, I need to be seeing myself as someone who is there to coach and to lead people in gaining new knowledge. And so just looking at how can you be your whole best and most authentic self, and how can you be seen as less that this is me and my job, and start to think about how can we get to know each other, and how can you be more authentic, and how can you connect. And I think this is my opinion, but I think we've moved from years ago where companies used to have parties and you'd have family get-togethers on the weekends and your friends were your people at work to just doing your job and we just don't get together as a company anymore as an organization. Or if you're recognized, it's only certain people that get recognized and get taken out to the baseball game or whatever. We need to start recognizing everyone. And um, and I think we have that added challenge of doing that in an environment where we're now more disconnected from people than ever. And we have all these different ways to connect, but we need time together to work together. And I think we're going to have to swing that pendulum back to where we have at least scheduled time to be together. So consider that as well. And it's kind of a challenge to you is how can you be as authentic and human as possible at work? So our last poll is I want you to identify the single mindset, single, so you only get to choose one that that you would most like to demonstrate as a leader that you don't already demonstrate. So if you already see yourself as a catalyst and somebody who's really good at collaboration and partnerships, then you would choose something that you're not currently doing. So this is more of a personal question to get you to think about what it is that you would like to improve on. I still challenge with being collaborative, um, and that's something I'm going to continue to work on. So give you about 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes, 10 more seconds. Sorry about that. So it's interesting. I like to see that 31% of you are trying to be more, that co-creator, that creative side of things, and the mindset of imagining. One of the things we've talked about in past webinars, as well as in our education materials, is if you want to have an innovative workplace, you have to give people time to think. They can't just go from meeting to meeting to meeting. And so, as a leader, think about how you can give both yourself and your people time to do that imagining. I also liked that the catalyst piece, that the mindset of collaboration and partnerships. If you're working in a team, you've got to be collaborative. The human part got the lowest votes. I'm just saying that maybe you already feel that you're being human and authentic, which is really, really great. So kind of in conclusion, we know that an organization's leaders impact its resilience and how the organization responds to uncertainty and change. I just want to remind you that different leadership styles might be needed based on whatever the situation is. And so you should be becoming better at changing your leadership style and using your emotional intelligence to understand when you need to do so. Try to be more adaptive and inclusive in your leadership style. And just really recognize that a lot of people really took time during the pandemic if you had to, if you weren't in the medical field or another field where you were actually more stressed and had less time. But those of us that had the opportunity to kind of stop and consider, um, and if you haven't been able to do that, try to take some time to think about what kinds of mindset you might need to have moving forward. There's some really great resources here. We will send the resources out with your attendance certificate so that you can take a look at those. And we do have some time for questions. So let me see if any of you have questions. One of the questions that asked is, what's my view on groupthink as a leader? Well, that's a great question. And that question is why you need to have diversity in your group, because groupthink is very, very dangerous. And you need to be calling out people that don't think like you do. And one of my friends and we've been friends since we were 8. And people ask us all the time is like, how do you guys, they just don't, they are surprised to see that we're really as close of friends that we've had over these years. And part of it is longevity. But the second part of it is that we're totally different from each other. And we have just learned to appreciate that about each other. And she's the first person I call when I have to make a difficult decision. And I feel like I need somebody to give me the opposite opinion as to what I might have. I see a hand raised, but I can't call on you. So if you could put a question, or maybe that's a thumbs up, not sure. But if there's any other questions, I'd love to. We'll give about 30 more seconds to ask those questions. Yeah, but groupthink is so painful. And not just painful, it's a dangerous piece. And it is something that we all need to be very, very aware of. And it's hard. By the way, I like it when people agree with me. I like to have those people around me. Those are the people I want to surround myself with, people that make me feel good about my ideas. But it can also be really dangerous. So let's go ahead and close. I do see another question pop up I just before I close. Um, the question was I wanted to ask about Catalyst as the way of now. I think Catalyst is I feel that all four of those positive ones are really important. Um, I would like to think that I've been a catalyst as part of what ICOR is doing. And that's something, trying to come up with, okay, this is what we have. How can we think about this in a new way? But getting people to agree with you is is also can, when people say, I don't know what you're talking about, can also sometimes be challenging. Um, One of the comment that was just made, politics and other things are really impacting leadership style. And so one of the things that we've talked about in culture is understanding international cultures and understanding that we're lucky, people that are on this call from the United States, and I'll just say maybe North America, we feel empowered to not always go along, but there's other countries where consensus is the way life operates. And so you have to be cognizant of the international culture that you're working in. And if you're working in a global environment, understanding that how you lead in with one part of your organization and one part of the world might be different than how you lead in another. There's actually a really good workshop. They're like 4-minute video clips that talk about that. And if you want to know that, I can reach out and share that with you. I can't remember who it is off the top of my head. I'm very bad at names, but I'd be happy to share that with you. So just as we conclude today, a lot of what we talked about today is included in our Certified Organizational Resilience series of courses as we talk about leadership and behaviors and culture. We also teach, kind of take a deep dive on other courses that manage risk, whether they're in business continuity or crisis management, our data center courses, and how we manage our technology. Upcoming webinars, everything that's in gray we've already done, and you can view on our YouTube station, our YouTube channel, as well as they are available as if you're a member of the ICOR. And next month, we're going to have a guest speaker coming from Peru, talking about how a consulting firm really looked at their road to resilience and what are their strategies for what they're trying to improve on. So thank you everyone for attending, and we hope you'll connect with us if you haven't already. Join our LinkedIn, take a look at our ICOR YouTube channel, and thank you very much, and we hope to see you again next month.